There are two different ways to make the Asanoha pattern, the 3 and 2 piece method. The 3-piece method is a bit simpler because all the pieces are the same. We'll start by cutting all the pieces to a rough length. Their length will differ depending on the size of your jigumi spacing. It's a good idea to cut more than you might think you need, just in case you cut some too short. For one Asanoha pattern, you need 18 pieces, so I'm cutting 21. Kumiko jigs are essential for making kumiko. This is how the pieces are cut with accurate angles and lengths. To begin this pattern, we'll cut a point on one end of all the pieces with a 30-degree jig. It helps to take a few light passes with the chisel raised off of the jig, but the chisel should be flat against the jig for the final pass. Try your best not to damage the jig, but this might take some practice. Having very sharp chisels makes the cutting much easier. Alternatively, you can use a small plane. Here I'm using a kiwakana. This method is quicker, but there's more of a risk of damaging the jig. It helps to have the blade protruding just a small amount. With all the pieces cut on one end, we can set the 30-degree jig aside and cut the opposite end with a 60-degree jig. While cutting any of the angles, make sure the cuts come to a point on the end. If there's a flat spot, readjust the jig and cut again. When cutting this opposite end, we're also cutting the pieces to length. So start by cutting them longer than you might need and focus on just 3 pieces for now. These pieces turned out to be too long, which is better than them being too short. While trimming them, remember that you're removing 3 times the amount of material that you adjust the jig, because all the pieces will be cut to this new length. A small adjustment of the jig can make a big difference. Once you have these 3 pieces fitting nicely, you can continue to cut the rest of them for this pattern. Assuming your jigumi is accurate, all the pieces should be the same length. If you're interested in learning how to make the jigumi, I have a video link that shows the process using a Kumiko table saw sled. These sleds are also available for purchase if you're interested. Unlike the previous method, the pieces are different for the 2-piece method. This can be a bit more complicated, but I believe it's much quicker once you get the hang of it. Let's start with the larger piece, the hinge piece. Just like before, start by rough cutting some pieces. You'll need 6, but definitely cut some extras as these are pretty easy to make a mistake on. Next, cut a point on one end of all of the pieces with the 30-degree jig. With all of them cut, cut the opposite end of one piece. This cut determines the length, so focus on just one for now. There are a couple different ways to check if this length is accurate. You could check against two pieces from the previous method. The hinge piece should be the exact same length as two pieces. This needs to be trimmed a bit. The two pieces can also be used to mark the center of the hinge piece for the cut, although it's a good idea to double check with a ruler. When marking this line, use a square and a marking knife. This will give a much finer line to follow than a pencil would. Next, cut along this line, but not all the way through. It's important to use a thin curved blade for this. This Japanese saw is specially designed for Kumiko, and has a thinner curve than most other Japanese saws. There's a link in the description if you want to look into it. There's one more way to check if the length is accurate. With the piece in place, align a straight edge with the tip of the triangle one end of the piece sits in, across that triangle's base, and to the tip of the opposite triangle. If your piece is the correct length, the corner created by the hinge should line up with the straight edge. After confirming the piece is the correct length, cut the rest of the pieces with the 30-degree jig set to that length. You can add a guide to either side of your saw blade to aid with the proper depth of cut. The guides should be set so the teeth of the saw are just shallower than the thickness of the strips. Make sure you use strong clips so the guides don't move. The guides in this case are just thin strips of walnut. With all the hinge pieces cut, they can be fit into the jigumi. There's one more piece to cut to complete this pattern. This piece has a 30-degree point on either end and follows all the principles from the previous pieces. Rough cut the piece to length, trim one end of all the pieces to a 30-degree point, and then flip the piece around and cut the opposite end with a 30-degree point to its appropriate length. With all the pieces cut, you can complete the pattern. One of the nice things about the two-piece method is that you only need a 30-degree jig. The three-piece method requires a 30 and 60-degree jig. Now that you know how to make the Asanoha pattern, feel free to play around with different arrangements and different types of woods to get different designs.